NFC fields were turned off. Suddenly.
It was 2 years ago. 2 years ago that GSC told us what our PCs needed for us to enjoy Stalker 2. 2 roki jebać skotiniaka taka. Any bliat. I'm lucky to have two PCs that pound for pound match the Cenozoic system requirements that GSC gave us back in 1999, back when the game was still on Unreal Engine IV. And if what we've seen from the demands of Unreal Engine V is anything to go on, we are Unreal Engine fucked. Luckily, my everyday system is pretty much a one-to-one match to the recommended requirements with a Matisse Ryzen 7, a 3700X, and a Radeon RX 6600 XT. Just a tiny bit better than the 5700X that they recommend. But also, courtesy of my lovely sister, we have my old Sandy Bridge system. I rebuilt this machine for her and she's let us use it. It's using an Intel Xeon E5 1660 that pretty much matches the recommended Ryzen 5 1600. But there's an important note to make here. This is an old CPU with 6 cores, 12 threads, similar clocks, similar scores on benchmarks that show that an old CPU can still hold up today. So a lot of you guys with old systems will probably be fine because of the brute force nature of x86. Dinosaur or not, if it's got the power, mathematically speaking, your CPU will work. But this will not scale equally with graphics cards. So this Kepler GTX 780 Ti might be a really close match to the minimum requirement of an RX 580 or GTX 1060, but it is not supported. It can still run games like Cyberpunk 2077 to this day, but AMD GPUs older than Polaris and Nvidia GPUs older than Maxwell will simply not even run Unreal Engine 5 games. So if that's you, it's time for an upgrade, which is why I put my trusty RX 480 into our minimum spec machine. Dudes, I'm so fond of this card because it carried me through both cryptocurrency crises when GPU prices were through the roof.
Yeah, fuck you, Ethereum.
So we're going to run 1, 2, 3 games. RoboCop Rogue City and Immortals of Avium are both shooters on Unreal Engine 5 with similar recommended specs to Stalker 2, and Cyberpunk 2077, like Stalker 2, is an open world game, but the important part here is that CDPR and GSC are both stating the exact same specs for their games. So I think Cyberpunk will be worth a go, and go we shall. Our minimum spec machine impressed me somewhat by being able to get 60 FPS in RoboCop at the lowest setting with FSR performance at 1080p. It doesn't look great, but it's certainly not impossible to play the game this way. But if you want more visual clarity, you can bring up FSR to quality and settle for 30 FPS. This is without a doubt a compromised experience though, but you can absolutely run the game from start to finish. I wouldn't want to play like this though. A lot of RoboCop's style and flair comes from lumen lighting, tons of particle effects, nanite, and none of these get to shine on the Polaris card. Immortals of Avium is next, and it's a similar story. I'm happy to say that yeah, it'll run the game at 60 FPS with ultra performance this time. It's not that enjoyable to look at, so if you want more clarity, you can settle for balanced at 30 FPS, which is just not a good frame rate to play at high-paced games like this one. FSR 3 frame gen is technically not compatible with this card, even though you can run it, but latency is just way too high. So in conclusion, the RX 580, 480, they're about the same thing, maybe the GTX 1060 as well, are going to run Unreal Engine 5 games, and that's about it. But Cyberpunk 2077 tells a different story. It is a good example of what happens when developers take the time to optimize for their minimum spec as well as their recommended spec. The Steam Deck preset for this card is wonderful. Not only is visual quality high, but it's also very playable at 60 FPS. Keep in mind, this card has comparable power to an Xbox One X. The reason this works is because CDPR intentionally optimized for the Steam Deck and low-spec machines really benefited from it. So if GSC were to optimize for the Steam Deck, hypothetically, well, Stalker 2 might run well on this card, but that's a big if. So in conclusion, the minimum spec machine only gets across as a good experience in Cyberpunk. RoboCop and Immortals of Avium are just acceptable. If GSC really optimizes Stalker 2 for low spec machines, might be able to hold on to your 1060 or 480 just a little bit longer, or if you're in a really tight budget, slap one of those into your PC. Because these cards do have the VRAM for the specs they're running. Well, at least the 480 with 8 gigs. Because even though GSC say 6 gigs minimum, I'd look at the Xbox Series S with kind of 8, not doing so hot with that. Now with the funky chonky good the recommended spec machine, there should be no surprises here. It gives us a massive boost in visual quality, performance, and we also get to benefit from new generation features like frame gen. That thing is a game changer. AMD's AMILF-MF thing that you'll see in a minute works really well with this card. RoboCop runs at high settings, 1080p, way clear of 60 FPS, really showing off the Unreal Engine 5 strengths beautifully. Just compare the upgrade you're getting from the RX 480. You'll get literally double the power and it shows. And stack frame gen on top of that, and oof, you know that the developers meant for you to have this experience at the very least when they made this game. But having double the power without double the memory will bite us, because in Immortals of Avium, we were doing fine at high settings until we weren't, because we ran into issues with VRAM, and we're forced to bring everything down for some sections of the game. The Navi chip itself was doing fine, it can run the game on high. We just ran out of VRAM, and this is going to happen, especially if you go above 1080p. Finally, Cyberpunk did terrifically at Ultra with XeSS quality. I just like how that looks in this game better than FSR. Since XeSS performs worse than FSR, FrameGen filled in the performance gaps more or less that I lose by choosing it over FSR, making it still produce a buttery smooth picture. Not only that, this card can do ray tracing. Kind of. You can get away with picking a single ray trace setting that you think is really important. Like in Cyberpunk, I think reflections give the game's presentation a massive boost, just like your mom is massive. In Stalker 2, that setting is definitely going to be lighting. The reason I said kind of is because you're going to have to settle for 30 FPS, and FrameGen does bring the smoothness to make it look like 60, but it comes at the expense of latency, and it's gonna feel like a PlayStation 3 game, but that's not unplayable, it's just not immediately responsive, but it does look a lot better than 30. It's not as bad as Killzone 2 input lag or Battlefield 3 at launch input lag. If you were there, you know, but it is there. But if you want to ray trace on AMD, you're going to want a 7000 series card, and on NVIDIA, you're going to want at least a 3000 series card, because first gen RT is just not it. Okay, genius. The recommended spec gave us a game experience that you can recommend for 1080p. Wow. Very work. Much nice. No surprises there, really. But there is one more series of tests that we need to run. What if we take this thick boy RX 6600 XT? Man, like, look at this cute little ITX case, and that massive chonker boy was in there. Anyway, we take it out of our recommended spec machine and cram it into our really spacious minimum spec machine with the Xeon E5. And would you look at this? The experience playing RoboCop using the recommended GPU with the recommended CPU is indistinguishable from playing on the fully recommended machine. This game is such a bloody display of violence. God, I love it. And if I told you that it's the exact same thing for Immortals of Avium, would you believe me? Except that I didn't run into any VRAM issues this time around, but I'd prepared to face them regardless. I just think I was in sections that don't demand as much VRAM. This game isn't really optimized for 8GB or for low spec machines. It doesn't even have a real low setting. It goes from ultra to high to low. It is so important for developers to include proper medium settings, especially textures, because 8GB is what most people have in their graphics cards, and you'd be surprised at how much you can get away with running medium textures with everything else on high with modern GPUs. It's pretty incredible. So developers, please, please, please optimize your medium textures for 8 gigs of RAM. I beg you. Just please don't make your medium textures look lazy. Thank you. Goodbye. And finally, you knew it, I knew it, Cyberpunk ran excellently. I got a little bit goofy and... there has to be a bug. This has to be a bug. Because I don't believe it. But it has to be a bug. Sure, it's on performance. You can FSR performance. But this is path tracing on. Yeah, it's given us an alright experience with path tracing. But it's path tracing. Uh-oh, this is trouble. Alright, I don't know what to think anymore. But I still can't believe it. Like... and it crashed. I knew it was gonna happen. It did max out on VRAM, but I knew it was gonna crash. Yup, the 6600 XT can technically play Cyberpunk on low settings with path tracing enabled, which is redonkulous. Yes, it still looks awful because AMD doesn't have denoisers for path tracing, and compared to my 47, it's no competition. And yeah, I kinda lied. I put a 4070 in my daily driver PC during the production of this video, so when I showed it off, it was already in there, and yeah, my little sister got a really nice upgrade with her new 6600 XT. May it serve her well. But it is safe to say that yeah, the recommended GPU with the minimum CPU performs very well in games that seemingly require the same sources that Stalker 2 says it will require. But the most important requirement is something I've saved for last. It's an SSD. The minimum spec machine was running games off a SATA SSD, while the recommended spec machine did so on a Gen 4 NVMe. Yes, the difference in SSD speed was noticeable in loading times, but it was also noticeable in gameplay. While it was rare, our machine with the SATA SSD did run into texture popping. But at this point, we can go ahead and say it. The system requirements that were given to us in 2021 are not good enough. Evidently, they were intended for the game's original release in Unreal Engine 4 before it was delayed so that it could migrate to Unreal Engine 5. And then delayed again because Huilo started doing Huilo shit. It does seem, however, that GSC have been making the most out of this shit situation and putting their hearts fully into this project, which I'm so excited to experience. Anyway, I think the requirements should be updated, but perhaps not in the way you're thinking. I really like how some other games have announced their requirements, so here's my unofficial system requirement recommendations for Stalker 2, based on 0 minutes of Stalker 2 being played whatsoever. So, yeah. Keep in mind the consoles. Our first machine, the minimum spec machine, matches the Xbox Series S pretty closely. That'll give you like the minimum experience. And you guessed it, in the middle we have the minimum intended experience, which comes pretty close to the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5. Watch out for VRAM, but for the most part, you'll probably be fine. And finally, is a recommended PC for running modern games at 1440p, high settings, ray traced, 60 FPS with at least quality upscaling. And don't forget the SSD speeds. What are you gonna do? Upgrade? Build an entire PC? Play on console? Get a console? I want to know in the condoms below. It'll be nice to see where you guys are coming from so that I can get an idea where you guys are coming from. Since I got a new graphics card for Stalker 2, while we wait for that game to come out, I'm gonna go see how this puppy can run Clear Sky. So, bye.